Welcome. This is Dr. Michio Kaku, Professor of Theoretical Physics at the City College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And this is Exploration. Every week on Exploration, we discuss the fascinating world of science. And this week, once again, we're going to summarize some of the top stories in science. But before that, let me make a few comments. I got a lot of questions during my book tour. So instead of answering each one individually, I'm going to answer them collectively on this radio program. Questions, for example, about, well, one day, if we have a space program, will we encounter aliens from outer space? And if so, what will they look like? Are they going to look like us? Are they going to look like those creatures from Star Trek? Or something completely different? And for that matter, to reach the stars, you would have to be immortal. Or you would have to lengthen the human lifespan or alter the human body. And so what is the status? The status of whether or not one day we can become immortal, either biologically or digitally. And then we'll say a few things about UFOs. I get a lot of questions from people who claim they have seen a UFO. And so what do you do in case you've been kidnapped by aliens from outer space? And then we'll say a few things about the cutting edge of science. Scientists at the University of California at Santa Barbara have announced that they're getting closer and closer to what is called quantum supremacy. The point, the mythical point, when a quantum computer becomes more powerful than a conventional computer. And then, watch out. We're talking about, well, in the same way that the microchip changed human civilization. Some people think that quantum computers will go even farther in terms of revolutionizing human society. Okay, well, let's just jump right into some of the questions I got during the book tour. During the book tour, I got a lot of questions about the future of humanity in outer space. Many people pointed out to me that once we go to the stars, at some point in the distant future, then it means that we'll probably bump into alien civilizations out there. In which case, first of all, what are they going to look like? Everyone wants to know that. That's, quote, the money shot in any science fiction movie. In fact, in the movie Contact, which was inspired by the astronomer Carl Sagan, a lot of people were a little bit disappointed at the very end. After all this buildup, that is, making contact with a super intelligent civilization, at the very end of the movie, you expect to see the money shot. Nope. It turns out that the aliens could look like anything they want to look like, and in the end, they simply chose to look like us. Well, it turns out that evolution has something to say about which animals become intelligent. If you take a look at humans and compare them to the rest of the animal kingdom, you realize that, well, there really are three characteristics, at least three characteristics, which seem to have something to do with our becoming intelligent. First, we have stereo eyes. Now, why is that important? Because in general, predators are smarter than prey. Predators like foxes, tigers, sharks, they have eyes to the front of their face, while prey have eyes to the side of their face, like deer and rabbits, for example. And we say smart as a fox and dumb bunny. Why is that? Because predators, by definition, have to be smarter than prey. Predators have to know how to stalk, how to hide, how to have camouflage. They have to know the characteristics of their prey. In other words, they have to have a little bit of smarts in order to hunt. However, if you are a deer, all you have to do is know how to run. Your eyes scan 360 degrees around you, allowing you to detect the presence of predators. And it doesn't take that much intelligence to simply run. While if you are a predator, you have to have stereo eyes so that you can zero in on the presence of the prey. So we think that once we meet intelligent life in outer space, perhaps they will be descended from predators. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be warlike and want to conquer us. However, it does mean that some of the characteristics of predators, that is the ability to hunt, the ability to detect patterns, the ability to zero in on things, Well, it turns out that aliens may have those characteristics. That's the first basic characteristic. The second is, well, the opposable thumb. And that's because you need some way to manipulate the environment, some way to create tools, some way to create instruments by which you can master the environment around you. For us, it was the opposable thumb. Now, take a look at your opposable thumb. It turns out that the size of your grasp is roughly the size of a tree branch in Africa a few million years ago. That's right. In other words, your opposable thumb was not created so that you can manipulate tools. No, that's not why you have an opposable thumb. The opposable thumb was basically used for swinging in trees. After all, we have a tailbone, don't we? We used to have tails. We used to swing in trees. And the size of your grasp is roughly the size of a tree branch millions of years ago in Africa. Now, once we have an encounter with an intelligent species in outer space, they may not have an opposable thumb, but they may have a tentacle. They may have a claw, some way of manipulating the world around them. That's probably going to be one of their major characteristics. And the third basic characteristic is language. That's right, language. You realize that if you raise a child and a chimpanzee at the same time, you realize that for the first 2 years, they're very similar. Vocabulary, crying, looking around, wondering about the environment. Yeah, baby chimps and baby humans are roughly the same. But then around age 2, something dramatic happens. The baby's vocabulary just keeps on soaring. The brain starts to explode in size. You're talking about the fact that a child, let's say 5, 6 years old, will already know several thousand words. In fact, they learn several words a day. If you get a tape recorder and go into a nursery and tape record babies at night, yeah, they babble. But what do they babble? They babble the language of their parents, perfecting the feedback, getting the intonation correctly. In other words, they're consolidating their vocabulary at night. Monkeys, however, they have a vocabulary, maybe tens of words, because they don't really need much more than that. It's perfectly fine to have a vocabulary of only tens of words in order to survive in the forest if that's all you want to do. But you see, we are different. We're different because we're short, clumsy. We don't run very fast. From an animal's point of view, we're a loser. I mean, think about it. Animals can fly. Animals can run much faster than us. Animals can have talons. They can have claws. They can have tentacles. They can have much more superhuman abilities than poor, puny humans. In other words, we had to evolve. We had to create something that gave us an edge over those animals that were faster, that could fly, that could do all sorts of things that we cannot. And what was that? The brain. The brain explodes in size after birth. You realize that when a child is born, they're basically a fetus. That is, the brain is not well formed at all. But after they're born, that's when the brain starts to really explode in size outside the womb. Now, why is that? Anthropologists believe that it's because of the size of our birth canal. That was the price we paid for walking upright. The fact that we walk upright puts a limit to how big the birth canal can be, and therefore puts a limit in terms of the size of the brain at birth. But we need a lot more brain power to survive and compete in a forest where we are maladapted, where we don't run fast, we can't fly, we don't have talons, we don't have claws, we don't have big muscles. No, in order for us to be competitive with all the other animals, we had to expand in brain size. And that's why the brain explodes in size after birth. Now, you realize that this has, in some sense, biblical implications. Because what was the penalty to Eve for giving the apple to Adam? According to the Bible, it was pain in childbirth. So why do women have pain in childbirth? It seems so unnecessary. It's because of the explosion in the size of the brain, but the size of the birth canal, because of mechanics, is already at the maximum size, And that's why women have pain in childbirth, because in some sense, it's the punishment for knowledge, the punishment for a big brain. And in fact, when kids get older, why do they like to play? If you ever looked at children playing, playing consists of basically copying human society, taking a small little snippet of human society and working out the consequences. Well, some people think that the reason for play is precisely so that young children can digest the complexities of human behavior. Human society is quite complex. You have hierarchies, you have emotions, you have status symbols, you have politeness, etiquette. It's very complicated. So how do children learn it? By playing, by capsulizing a snippet of human society, like cops and robbers and cowboys and Indians, by capsulizing a snippet of human society and then going through it over and over again till kids, quote, get it. So in other words, the price we paid for a human brain was huge. We paid an enormous price. It takes 18 years or more for the brain to reach maturity. While in the animal kingdom, when a horse is born, I mean, by golly, after a few hours, they're running with the pack. In fact, if they don't run with the pack, they die. It's as simple as that. So for horses, they don't need a big brain. But you see, the big brain gave us a competitive advantage, and that's why we like to play. So the point I'm raising is, one day in the future when we do make contact with intelligent life in outer space, chances are they're not going to look like us, but they'll have some kind of stereo vision or maybe sonic vision or some sensor that allows them to hunt for prey. 2, some way to manipulate the environment. It could be a tentacle, claws, or opposable thumb or whatever. And 3rd, some kind of language to hand down information from generation to generation, because animals don't do that. Animals don't need to do that because the brain is really overrated in the forest. Most forest animals can do quite well because they have an advantage. They can fly. They can run fast. They have a thick skin. They have claws, whatever. We have no advantage. And that means that we have to compensate. And that's why we have a big brain. Well, another question I got traveling around the country is the question of, well, look at the Silicon Valley entrepreneurs who are funding the space program now. Elon Musk of SpaceX. We're talking about Jeff Bezos of Amazon, the richest man in the world. They're not simply backing the space program because they're altruistic. No, they want a return. And so what happens one day when we have a traffic jam around the moon and somebody puts a flag on the moon and claims the moon? What are we going to do then? Or for that matter, Google billionaires have already set their sights on the asteroid belt. They want to mine the asteroids. And so the question is, how do we make sense, political sense, of all the chaos that's going to happen once private enterprise and different nations begin to colonize outer space? Well, we do have a potential solution. It's called the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. The Outer Space Treaty basically banned nuclear weapons from outer space and said that nations cannot claim celestial bodies, but not much more, and only in vague terms. There are huge loopholes in that. The simplest loophole is because, well, private enterprise is now entering into the picture. And when the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 was written, nobody believed that one day we could have private billionaires financing a moon rocket. I mean, people would have said, come on, give me a break. Because after all, it took nation states, billions and billions of dollars in order to create the Apollo rockets that could take us to the moon. And the idea that a private individual could finance a moon rocket was considered ridiculous. Well, welcome to the future. Elon Musk, a Silicon Valley and SpaceX and Tesla Motors billionaire, he has created the Falcon Heavy rocket with his own private funds, not taxpayers' money. And the Falcon rocket is a moon rocket. That's right. The Falcon Heavy rocket can take the Dragon capsule and containing astronauts all the way to the moon. And so what happens when the Chinese put their flag on the moon? What happens when the Indians send a space probe past Mars and want to claim some of Martian property? We need a new treaty. A new treaty that will ban not just nuclear weapons, but conventional weapons as well, and make some kind of regulation in terms of who can put their flag on the moon. So, in other words, rather than simply speculate, the nations of the world have to sit down and work out the details of a new outer space treaty of 1967. Also, another question I got on the book tour concerned, well, UFOs. It turns out that, of course, the United States Pentagon has been investigating UFOs. We now know that. In fact, if the Pentagon did not investigate UFOs, they would be derelict. Because, of course, there's always a chance that they could pose a national security threat. So, of course, the Pentagon is going to be investigating UFOs. But then the question is, well, what are they? Well, I get a lot of emails from people who claim that they've seen a UFO. And basically, the UFOs that I get, the reports that I get, can be dismissed, about 90% of them, for being natural phenomena. That is, we're talking about swamp gas, we're talking about radar echoes, we're talking about weather balloons, meteors from outer space, even the planet Venus. These are all objects which have set off a flurry of false alarms. However, the last remaining 5%, 10%, the last remaining handful of these sightings, they really make you shiver. Because, well, the consequences are enormous. First of all, we're talking not just about one farmer in a field claiming that they've seen some kind of bright lights in the forest. No, we're not talking about that. We're talking about seasoned pilots, not just one, but several, locking in on radar and visually with an object that then begins to travel faster than a supersonic jet. And then you begin to realize, oh my God, this does not seem natural at all. No natural phenomenon can explain these things. And so then the question is, well, what are they? Well, there's several possibilities. One possibility that I think should be taken very seriously is that they could be hypersonic drones. We know for a fact that Area 51 is, in fact, the place where the military tests its advanced rockets. And, of course, there has to be a place to test them. It has to be secret. So, bingo, you would expect that the military would have an Area 51. And the stealth bomber was perfected there. Now, the stealth bomber is not invisible. It is certainly visible with the naked eye. But on radar, radar is diffused as it bumps into the stealth bomber. And as a consequence, on your radar screen on the Earth, it looks like a fuzzy blip or a large bird. Certainly does not look like an advanced aircraft. And that's a stealth bomber. They can, in fact, be tracked. But it's more difficult because they diffuse the radar that bounces off the stealth bomber. Well, the military has experimented with other kinds of devices as well. They have an experimental craft that looks just like the space shuttle, except much smaller, that can be launched on a moment's notice. A space plane, a top-secret space plane launched by the military. Another project is drones, hypersonic drones, drones that travel much faster than any ordinary supersonic jet. And that's what some of these sightings could be about. Because these sightings indicate that these objects execute maneuvers that seem to be physically impossible with known technology. I mean, these are seasoned pilots with thousands of hours of experience, and they say they've never seen anything like this. And so one possibility is that they are, in fact, hypersonic drones. Well, let's also summarize a few of the top stories in science. One story comes out of the University of California at Santa Barbara, and it's about quantum computers. Now, you're going to be hearing more and more about quantum computers in the future, so let me tell you basically the reason why. First of all, we're now gradually reaching the limits of silicon. Silicon Valley, of course, is the workhorse of the IT revolution. Billions, trillions of dollars are invested in high-tech firms, all of which use microchips. And then the question is, how far can you go? How many transistors could you put on a wafer of silicon? It turns out that we are now entering the end of the era of the microchip. Silicon Valley could become a rust belt in the future. Right now, your Pentium chip has a layer about 20 atoms across. 20 atoms across. That's how small these transistors are. However, in the near future, perhaps 10 years, who knows for sure, it may be 5 atoms across. And when you hit 5 atoms, then quantum mechanics takes over. And quantum mechanics is my specialty. That's what I do for a living. I use the quantum theory exploring something called string theory. So, at that point, silicon can no longer sustain calculations. We have to go to a higher computer, a computer that computes on atoms. Because if we're at the limit of what silicon can do, because we're now computing on atoms, then why not compute directly on atoms? In other words, if you have a magnetic field, atoms have a spin like a spinning top. You can align them with regards to the magnetic field. So they spin up, let's say. That would correspond to the number 1. When you flip it and the atom spins upside down, that's the number 0. So you can see that you can begin to count zeros and 1, which is the basis of digital, using the orientation of spinning tops, which are spinning atoms. Now, the advantage of quantum computers is, instead of being up and down, they can be anything in between. Now, normally you'd say to yourself, now that's stupid. How can you be anything in between 0 and 1? Either you're up or down. But you see, in quantum mechanics, you can be a mixture, something which violates everything we know about common sense. We know that objects exist in one state. Either you're dead or alive. Either you're here or there. Period. End of story, right? Wrong. It turns out in the quantum world, electrons can be here and there simultaneously, and atomic cats, in principle, could be dead and alive, or a mixture of the two. Well, if you could be between 0 and 1, or a mixture, you can contain billions of times more information than just zeros and ones. I mean, think about it. Not just zeros and ones, but anything in between. I mean, you're talking about an incredible increase in computer power. And sure enough, it turns out that quantum computers can beat any normal computer. Now, how do you measure quantum computers? Well, ordinary computers use bits, zeros and ones. Quantum computers use quantum bits or qubits, which can be in between zeros and 1. And the point at which a quantum computer becomes more powerful than an ordinary computer is called quantum supremacy. 50 qubits. I repeat, the magic number is 50 qubits. If somebody announces in their basement laboratory that they've perfected a quantum computer that can compute on more than 50 qubits, you could change world history. You could rewrite the history of the human race. I mean, think about it. Think of what the microchip did to our civilization, giving us the high-tech evolution. Think of what could happen if one day somebody creates a quantum computer. Now, what can you do with a quantum computer? Well, first of all, the CIA, the NSA, and all the intelligence agencies around the world are very much interested in the status of quantum computers. In fact, I spoke in Moscow just a few months ago, and in the audience was Medvedev, the former president of the Russian Federation. And yeah, one of the topics of discussion was quantum computers. Because, let's face it, people are onto something. They know that Silicon Valley could one day become a rust belt. The mantle of scientific progress could shift away from the United States to another country which perfects the quantum computer. Now, what's the catch? There's always a catch someplace, right? The catch is that precisely because you are computing on atoms, the slightest disturbance can ruin the calculation. Somebody sneezing a mile away, in principle, that could destroy the entire calculation. Now, when two atoms are vibrating in unison, that's called coherence. We want coherent atoms in order to do calculations. But when the atoms go out of phase. They're jumbled up, they're random, they're chaotic. That's called decoherence. So in one word, you can summarize a $1 trillion question. The fate of nations, the fate of the world economy may depend upon one word, and that is decoherence. Can you prevent a quantum computer from dribbling into nonsense by random fluctuations if somebody sneezed a mile away? Can you prevent that? Or can you get a pure form of atoms vibrating in unison that will give you the ability to do calculations like break foreign codes? It turns out a quantum computer can break any known code because codes are based on digital, and digitals are simple compared to quantum qubits. In fact, we know the CIA is interested in this. It turns out the CIA has all these leaked documents. Incredible. So many documents leaked from the CIA because someone steals a chip or a thumb drive from the military. We know from these documents that, yeah, the CIA has looked into it, but it's not ready for prime time yet. The decoherence problem is so far so great that no one has been able to hit the magic number of 50 qubits. At that point, history may shift. So the question is, when will this take place? Well, quite frankly, I don't know. Nobody else on the planet Earth knows. But think of the consequences. It could take several more decades before we reach it. But when that point is reached, human history can shift as a consequence. Just think about it. Think of what the microchip did for us in the last several decades. Think of what a quantum computer could do in the coming years. Good day.